You know that feeling when you think you know someone your entire life and then they die and leave you a letter that changes everything? Well, my dad did exactly that. And what I found in that letter didn't just shock me, it destroyed my relationship with my brother and turned our family inheritance into a legal nightmare that's still haunting me today. But before I tell you what my father wrote on his deathbed, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because stories like this one, real stories about family secrets that tear people apart, they're exactly what we dive into on this channel. And trust me, you're gonna want to hear how this one ends. My name is Sarah, and I need to tell you about my brother Marcus. Growing up, Marcus was what you'd call the golden child. Not in an obvious way, my parents weren't the type to openly play favorites, but in all those subtle ways that eat at you over the year. When Marcus graduated high school, Dad bought him a car. When I graduated 2 years later, I got a congratulations card with $50 inside. When Marcus decided to study business at State University, Dad paid his tuition without question. When I wanted to study art therapy, suddenly there were long conversations about practical degrees and return on investment. Don't get me wrong, I loved my brother. We weren't enemies or anything like that, but there was always this underlying current, this sense that Marcus was the heir apparent to Dad's construction business, and I was just the daughter who'd eventually get married and move away. Dad owned Mitchell Construction, a mid-sized company he'd built from nothing over 30 years. Started with just him and a pickup truck, grew it into something that employed 23 people and pulled in about $2 million a year. It wasn't Fortune 500 money, but it was solid generational wealth, the kind of business that could set your kids up for life. Marcus joined the company right after college. I moved to Portland and became a therapist. I'd come home for holidays, and Dad would spend dinner talking about expansion plans and new contracts, always directing the conversation toward Marcus. Tell Sarah about the Henderson project. Marcus really showed leadership on that one. I told myself I didn't care. I had my own life, my own career. I was helping people heal from trauma. That had to count for something, right? But deep down, yeah, it stung, especially when Mom would pull me aside and say things like, your father loves you just as much as Marcus. The fact that she felt the need to say it told me everything. 3 years ago, Dad had his first heart attack. Not a massive one, but enough to scare him. He started talking about succession planning, about making sure the business would survive if something happened to him. Marcus was 32 then. I was 30. Dad was 58 and acting like he was planning his funeral. I need to get my affairs in order, he kept saying. He met with lawyers, updated his will, set up trust funds. Marcus was going to inherit the business. That was never in question. But Dad assured me I'd be taken care of. He never specified what that meant, but I assumed it meant some kind of financial settlement. Maybe not half of everything, but enough to matter. I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed for details. But there's something about discussing your parents' death that makes you want to avoid the conversation altogether. So I nodded and smiled and told him I trusted his judgment. That was my first mistake. Dad's health got worse gradually, then all at once. The second heart attack came 18 months later, and this time it did more damage. He couldn't work the same hours anymore.
Marcus essentially took over day-to-day operations, which made sense. Dad would still come in for a few hours each morning, but mostly he was at home, frustrated and feeling useless. I started visiting more often. Portland was only a 4-hour drive, and I could see Dad was struggling with the loss of control. He'd built his entire identity around being the guy who solved problems, who made decisions, who kept everything running. Now he was sitting in his recliner, watching other people run his company. During one of these visits, about 6 months before he died, Dad pulled me aside. We were in his workshop, this cluttered garage space where he kept his old tools and tinkered with projects. He looked tired, older than his 59 years. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. About the business. About the will." I felt my stomach drop. "Dad, you don't have to." "No, I do. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm not sure I made the right choices. Marcus is good at the business side, but he doesn't understand people the way you do. He's too much like me, all about the bottom line, not enough about the human element." He paused, running his hand over an old saw blade. "I've been watching how he manages the crew since I stepped back. He's efficient, I'll give him that, but he fired Jerry Martinez last month because Jerry's productivity was down. Jerry's been with us for 8 years. And his productivity was down because his wife has cancer. Marcus saw a numbers problem. I saw a family that needed support. I didn't know what to say. Dad had never criticized Marcus like this before. I'm not saying Marcus is a bad person, but sometimes I wonder if I did him a disservice, always pushing him toward the business. Maybe he would have been happier doing something else. And maybe the business would be better off with someone who sees the bigger picture. He looked directly at me then. "Someone like you." I felt my heart racing. "Dad, I don't know anything about construction. You know about people. You know about building trust, about communication, about creating environments where people can thrive. Those are the skills that matter most when you're running a team. He didn't say anything definitive that day, but the conversation stuck with me. I started paying more attention during family dinners, watching how Marcus talked about the employees, how he approached problems. Dad was right. Marcus was all about efficiency and profit margins. When Dad suggested giving the crew a Christmas bonus, Marcus pulled out spreadsheets showing how it would impact quarterly earnings. I began to wonder if Dad was reconsidering his succession plans, but I never asked directly, and he never brought it up again. We had other conversations in the garage over the next few months, but they were mostly about my work, my life in Portland, his memories of building the business. Then came the third heart attack. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Mom's voice was shaky. "Sarah, you need to come home. Your father's in the hospital." I threw some clothes in a bag and drove through the night. Marcus was already at the hospital when I arrived, still in his work clothes from the day before. The doctors weren't optimistic. Dad had coded twice in the ambulance, and the damage to his heart was extensive. He was conscious when I got to his room, but barely. The machines were doing most of the work. Mom was holding his hand, and Marcus was standing by the window, looking out at the parking lot with his arms crossed. "Hey, Dad," I said, taking his other hand. His grip was weak, but he squeezed my fingers. "Sarah," his voice was barely a whisper. "Glad you're here." The next 2 days were a blur of medical consultations, family phone calls, and long stretches of sitting in uncomfortable hospital chairs. Dad would drift in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he'd be lucid enough to have short conversations. Other times he'd be completely out. On Thursday afternoon, the doctor pulled us aside. "We've done everything we can," he said. "I think it's time to consider comfort care. The decision to remove life support is something you never prepare for, even when you know it's coming." We gathered around Dad's bed, Mom, Marcus, me, and my Aunt Linda, Dad's sister. The machines were still running, but we knew they'd be turned off soon. That's when Dad asked for paper and a pen. "I need to write something," he said. His voice was stronger than it had been all week, like he was drawing on some final reserve of energy. Marcus found a notepad in the room, and I helped prop Dad up so he could write. His handwriting was shaky, but legible. He wrote for about 5 minutes, pausing frequently to rest his hand. None of us could see what he was writing. The angle was wrong, and he was hunched over the paper. When he finished, he folded the paper in half and looked directly at me. "Sarah, this is for you. Don't open it now. Wait until after the funeral." He handed me the folded paper. I could see Marcus watching from the corner of my eye, but I didn't look at him. I just took the paper and slipped it into my purse. "Promise me," Dad said. "After the funeral." "I promise, Dad." He died 6 hours later, just after midnight on Friday morning. The last thing he said was, "Tell the crew I'm proud of them." The funeral was on a Tuesday. Half the town showed up. Dad had been a fixture in the community for 30 years, and Mitchell Construction had worked on houses and buildings throughout the county. The church was packed, and the burial service had to be held in the larger cemetery pavilion to accommodate everyone. Marcus gave the eulogy. He talked about Dad's work ethic, his dedication to quality, his role as a mentor to young employees. It was a good speech, heartfelt and respectful, but I kept thinking about what Dad had said in the workshop about Marcus not understanding people. Even in the eulogy, Marcus focused on Dad's professional achievements rather than his personal relationships. The reception was held at the American Legion Hall. People shared stories about Dad, about projects he'd worked on, about times he'd helped people out when they were struggling. Jerry Marquinez was there, the employee Marcus had fired. He came up to me with tears in his eyes. "Your dad was a good man," he said. "When my wife was going through chemo, he'd always check on us. Sometimes he'd have the crew come do little projects around our house, fixing a leaky faucet, painting a room, never charged us a dime. He said it was just neighbors helping neighbors." I realized I was crying, not just because Dad was gone, but because I was seeing a side of him I'd never fully appreciated. The business wasn't just about money to him. It was about being part of a community, about taking care of people. The next day, Marcus and I met with Dad's lawyer, Robert Chen. Robert had been Dad's attorney for 15 years. Handled all the business and corporation paperwork, the contracts, the legal side of running Mitchell Construction. "I'm sorry for your loss," Robert said, settling behind his desk in his downtime office. "Your father was a good man and a good client." He opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. "This is relatively straightforward. Your father updated his will about 18 months ago after his first heart attack." I remembered. Dad had mentioned meeting with lawyers, getting his affairs in order. "The primary asset is Mitchell Construction, which is valued at approximately $1.8 million. There's also the family home, valued at $300,000, various investment accounts totaling about $150,000, and some smaller assets. He looked at Marcus. Per your father's instructions, you inherit the business and all associated assets.
The house goes to your mother, with the provision that she can live there for the rest of her life, after which it passes to you. The investment accounts are also left to you. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. What about me? Robert consulted his notes. You receive a one-time payment of $25,000 and your father's personal effects, his tools, his workshop equipment, things like that. $25,000 out of a $2.3 million estate? I was getting $25,000? Marcus looked uncomfortable. Sarah, I had no idea. I thought you were getting more. Apparently not, I said. Could hear the bitterness in my voice. There is one other provision, Robert continued. Your father left specific instructions that if either of you contests the will, your inheritance is forfeited entirely. A non-contest clause? Dad had anticipated that I might fight this, and he'd built in a punishment for doing so. If I challenged the will, I'd get nothing at all. I sat there in stunned silence as Robert explained the next steps, the probate process, the timeline for transferring assets. I barely heard him. All I could think about was Dad's words in the workshop. Maybe the business would be better off with someone who sees the bigger picture, someone like you. Had I misunderstood? Had I read too much into our conversations? Or had something changed between then and when he updated his will? I remembered the folded paper in my purse, the letter Dad had written on his deathbed. I'd been carrying it around for 4 days, waiting for the right moment to read it. I think that covers everything, Robert was saying. Unless you have any questions. I stood up. No question. But I was lying. I had about 1,000,000 questions, and I was hoping Dad's letter would answer at least some of them. I waited until I got home to my apartment in Portland to read Dad's letter. I'd been staying at Mom's house since the funeral, but I couldn't handle another night of family dinners and awkward conversations about the inheritance. Marcus had tried to talk to me about it, saying he wanted to work something out, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on my couch, and carefully unfolded the paper. Dad's handwriting was shaky, but clear. Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've probably just met with Robert about the will. I know what you're thinking right now, and I need you to know that what I left you in the official will is not what I really wanted. I had to write the will the way I did because Marcus was pressuring me about the business, and I was sick and tired and didn't want to fight. But I've been thinking about our conversations in the garage, about what I said about you understanding people better than Marcus does. I meant every word. I'm leaving you this letter because I want you to know the truth about what I really intended. I want you to have half of everything. The business, the house, all of it. You and Marcus should be equal partners. I know I should have been braver and changed the will officially, but I was scared of the fight it would cause. Marcus has been planning his whole life around inheriting the business, and I didn't know how to tell him that I was having second thoughts. But you, Sarah, you have the heart for this work. You understand that it's not just about building things. It's about building communities, taking care of people, creating something that matters. Marcus is good at the business side, but he's missing the human element. You have that. I'm asking you to fight for what's right. I know there's a no contest clause in the will, but this letter is proof of my real intentions. Show it to Robert, show it to Marcus. Don't let them convince you that you don't deserve half of what I built. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to do this the right way, but I trust you to be braver than I was. I love you, sweetheart. Make me proud. Dad, P.S. Look in the workshop. Behind the old toolbox, there's a loose floorboard. I left something there for you. I read the letter 3 times before it really sunk in. Dad had wanted to leave me half of everything. The will I just heard read wasn't his real intention. It was a compromise he'd made because he was too sick and tired to fight with Marcus. But this letter changed everything. It was proof that Dad's mental state when he wrote the will might have been compromised, that he was under pressure from Marcus, that his true wishes were different from what the legal documents said. I called in sick to work the next day and drove back to my parents' house. Mom was at her sister's and Marcus was at the office, so I had the house to myself. I went straight to Dad's workshop. The space felt different now, smaller somehow. Without Dad's presence, it was just a cluttered garage full of old tools and half-finished projects. I found the old toolbox Dad had mentioned, a red Craftsman chest he'd had since I was a kid. It was heavy, but I managed to drag it away from the wall. Sure enough,
There was a loose floorboard behind it. I pried it up with a screwdriver and found a manila envelope underneath. Inside were photocopies of financial documents, business records, and a handwritten note dated just 3 weeks before Dad's death. If something happens to me, I want Sarah to know that Marcus has been taking money from the business, not stealing exactly, but paying himself bonuses and consulting fees that we never discussed. The attached documents show $120,000 in unauthorized payments over the past 18 months. I confronted him about it last week, and he said he was preparing for increased responsibility. I told him we needed to discuss this with a lawyer, but then I had the heart attack. I don't know if Marcus is dishonest or just entitled, but either way, Sarah needs to know the truth about the business finances before she decides what to do about the inheritance. I sat there on the workshop floor, surrounded by Dad's tools, holding evidence that my brother had been embezzling from the family business. The same brother who just inherited everything, who'd acted surprised and uncomfortable when he learned how little I was getting. Suddenly, Dad's decision to leave everything to Marcus made a different kind of sense. Maybe it wasn't favoritism or pressure from Marcus. Maybe Dad had been trying to protect me from inheriting a business that was being mismanaged. Or maybe he'd been planning to confront Marcus about the missing money and hadn't had the chance. Either way, I now had 2 pieces of evidence that could completely change the outcome of the inheritance: a deathbed letter expressing Dad's true wishes and documentation of Marcus's financial misconduct. I thought about the no contest clause in the will. If I challenged it and lost, I'd get nothing. But if I didn't challenge it, I'd be letting Dad down and letting Marcus get away with stealing from the family business. It was time to call Robert Chen. I called Robert's office first thing Monday morning. His secretary said he was in court, but he could see me at 2 p.m. I spent the morning researching inheritance law, trying to understand my options. What I learned wasn't encouraging. Challenging a will is expensive, time-consuming, and difficult to win. The courts generally assume that a person's final will reflects their true intentions, and the bar for proving otherwise is high. You have to show either that the person wasn't mentally competent when they signed the will, or that they were under undue influence from someone else. A deathbed letter might be considered evidence of mental competence. After all, Dad was lucid enough to write it, but it could also be seen as proof that his stated intentions in the will weren't his true wishes. The embezzlement evidence was more complicated.
It might be grounds for removing Marcus as executor of the estate, but it didn't necessarily prove that Dad wanted to change his will. In fact, it might support the opposite conclusion, that Dad left everything to Marcus because he knew Marcus would need to pay back the money he'd taken. I arrived at Robert's office with both pieces of evidence in a folder. He looked tired, like he'd had a long day in court. "Sarah, what can I do for you?" I handed him the letter. "I need you to read this." He put on his reading glasses and carefully examined the paper. I watched his expression change as he read, his eyebrows rising slightly. "This is expected," he said finally. "When did your father write this?" "The day before he died. In the hospital. I was there when he wrote it. And you have witnesses to this. My mother, my brother, my Aunt Linda. They all saw him write something and give it to me." Robert set the letter down and rubbed his temples. "Sarah, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you know the contents of your father's will before he died?" "No. I knew Marcus was inheriting the business, but I thought I was getting more than $25,000. "So your father never discussed the specific terms with you?" "No. He just said I'd be taken care of." Robert picked up the letter again. "This puts me in a very difficult position. If this letter represents your father's true intentions, then the will I drafted for him doesn't reflect his wishes. But if I help you challenge a will that I wrote, I'm essentially arguing that I failed to properly represent my client." I hadn't thought about that angle. Robert had a conflict of interest. He couldn't help me prove that the will was wrong without admitting professional negligence. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you need to get your own lawyer, someone who wasn't involved in drafting the original will." I showed him the financial documents from the workshop. "There's something else." He examined the papers, and I watched his face grow more serious. "These show payments to Marcus that weren't authorized by the board." "There is no board. It's just Dad and Marcus." "That's not entirely accurate. Your father incorporated the business as an LLC with himself as the managing member, but there were provisions for major financial decisions to be approved by all members. Marcus became a minority member when he joined the company, but he didn't have authority to unilaterally approve bonuses or consulting fees. So he was stealing. I wouldn't use that word without more investigation, but these payments appear to be unauthorized, yes. Robert leaned back in his chair. Sarah, I need to be very clear with you about something. If you decide to challenge this will, you're going to be fighting your brother over a substantial amount of money. It's going to be expensive, it's going to take months or years, and it's going to destroy your relationship with him permanently. What if I'm right? What if Dad really did want me to have half? Then you might win. But even if you do, you'll have spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees, and you'll have torn your family apart in the process. I stared at the letter in his hands. What would you do? I can't advise you on that, but I can tell you that these documents raise serious questions about the validity of the will and about Marcus's management of the business. If you decide to pursue this, you need to do it quickly. There are time limits on will contests. He gave me the names of 3 attorneys who specialized in estate litigation. As I left his office, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could accept the $25,000 and try to maintain some kind of relationship with my brother, or I could fight for what Dad claimed he really wanted and risk losing everything.
But there was a third option I hadn't considered yet, confronting Marcus directly. Maybe if I showed him the letter and the financial documents, he'd be willing to negotiate a settlement without going to court. It was worth a try. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I spent the next 2 days researching Mitchell Construction's finances. As Dad's heir, Marcus had access to all the business records, but I still had keys to the office and knew where Dad kept his personal copies of important documents. What I found was worse than I'd expected. The $120,000 in unauthorized payments to Marcus was just the tip of the iceberg. Over the past 2 years, Marcus had been systematically inflating his salary, approving bonuses for himself, and billing the company for personal expenses. The total was closer to $200,000. More troubling was what I discovered about the company's current financial state. Dad had always been conservative with money, keeping substantial cash reserves for emergencies, but those reserves were nearly gone. Marcus had been spending aggressively on new equipment, office renovations, and what he called business development expenses that looked suspiciously like personal spending. The company wasn't in immediate danger of bankruptcy, but it was nowhere near as healthy as the $1.8 million valuation suggested. If Marcus continued spending at this rate, Mitchell Construction would be in serious trouble within a year. I decided to confront him on Thursday evening. I waited until after work hours and went to the office. Marcus was still there, working late as usual. He looked up when I walked in, surprised to see me. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "If this is about the inheritance, I meant what I said. I want to work something out with you." "What kind of something?" "I was thinking maybe I could give you $100,000. It's not half, but it's more than what Dad left you." I pulled out Dad's letter and placed it on his desk. "Read this." Marcus picked up the letter, and I watched his expression change as he read. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at me. "Where did you get this?" "Dad wrote it in the hospital, the day before he died. You were there." I saw him write something, but I didn't know what it was. "He wanted me to have half of everything, Marcus. The will doesn't reflect his true wishes." Marcus ran his hands through his hair. "Sarah, you don't understand. Dad was on heavy medication those last few days. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was lucid when he wrote this, and it's consistent with conversations we'd been having for months." "What conversations?" I told him about our talks in the workshop, about Dad's concerns regarding Marcus's management style, about his comments on the importance of understanding people rather than just focusing on profit margin. Marcus listened without interrupting, but I could see his jaw tightening. When I finished, he stood up and walked to the window. "So Dad thought I wasn't good enough to run the business?" "That's not what he said. He said you were good at the business side, but you were missing the human element." "The human element." Marcus turned back to me. "Sarah, you don't know anything about running a construction company. You don't know about permits and inspections and scheduling and payroll. You don't know about dealing with suppliers and managing cash flow and bidding on contracts. You're right, I don't know about those things, but I know about managing people, about creating trust, about building relationships. Those are nice skills, but they don't keep a business running. I pulled out the financial documents from the workshop. Speaking of keeping the business running, can you explain these?
Marcus looked at the papers, and I saw something change in his expression. Fear, maybe? Or guilt? Where did you get these? Dad left them for me, along with a note explaining that you've been taking unauthorized payments from the company. Marcus sat back down heavily. It's not what it looks like. It looks like you stole $200,000 from the family business. I didn't steal anything. I was preparing to take over the company. I was working 60-hour weeks, taking on more responsibility than ever before. I deserve to be compensated for that. Did you discuss it with Dad? I tried to, but he was always too busy or too tired or too sick. So I made executive decisions about my own compensation. Executive decisions about your own compensation from a company you didn't own? Marcus's face was red now. I was doing everything but making the final decisions. I was essentially running the company for the last year of Dad's life. And now you want to officially inherit it. I earned it, Sarah. I gave up everything for this business. I worked here straight out of college while you went off to Portland to find yourself. I sacrificed my personal life, my relationships, everything for Mitchell Construction. And you helped yourself to $200,000 in the process. I was planning to discuss it with Dad after he recovered from the heart attack, but then he died, and suddenly I'm the bad guy for taking compensation I deserve? I looked at my brother, really looked at him. He believed what he was saying. In his mind, he hadn't stolen anything. He'd just given himself a raise that he felt he deserved. Marcus, what if Dad really did want me to have half? Then he would have changed his will. What if he was planning to, but he didn't have time? Marcus picked up the letter again. Sarah, this was written by a dying man on morphine. It's not legally binding. It's just the confused thoughts of someone who wasn't thinking clearly. So you're not willing to honor his wishes? I'm willing to honor his legally expressed wishes. The will. I realized this conversation wasn't going to end with Marcus agreeing to split the inheritance. He'd convinced himself that he deserved everything, and he wasn't going to be swayed by a deathbed letter or evidence of financial misconduct. I'm going to contest the will, I said. Sarah, don't. You'll lose everything. The no contest clause. I know about the no contest clause, but I also know that Dad's letter and your unauthorized payments give me grounds to challenge it. Marcus stood up. If you do this, you're going to destroy our family. I'm not the one who destroyed our family, Marcus. You did that when you decided to embezzle from Dad's business. I didn't embezzle anything. Then prove it in court. I walked toward the door, then turned back. I'm going to give you one chance to do the right thing. Split the inheritance 50-50 like Dad wanted. We can work together to run the business, or we can sell it and split the proceeds. But I'm not walking away with $25,000 while you get everything else. And if I refuse, then I'll see you in court. I hired Jennifer Walsh, one of the attorneys Robert had recommended. She was expensive, $400 an hour, but she specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for winning difficult cases. Jennifer reviewed Dad's letter, the financial documents, and the original will. Her assessment was cautiously optimistic. The deathbed letter is powerful evidence. Combined with the financial irregularities, it creates a narrative that your father was concerned about Marcus's management of the business and wanted to ensure you had equal inheritance rights. But your brother can argue that your father was medically compromised when he wrote the letter and that the financial payments were authorized by him as the managing member of the LLC.
It's not an easy case. We filed the contest petition 3 weeks after my conversation with Marcus. The legal documents were dense and formal, but the basic argument was straightforward. Dad's will didn't reflect his true intentions, and Marcus had exerted undue influence over him during the period when the will was written. Marcus hired his own attorney, David Hoffman, who had a reputation for aggressive litigation. Within days of receiving our petition, Hoffman filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the no contest clause should be enforced and that I should receive nothing. The judge denied the motion to dismiss, but scheduled a hearing on the validity of the no contest clause. If the judge upheld it, my case would be over before it started. The hearing was held on a gray Tuesday morning in late May. I sat next to Jennifer at the plaintiff's table, while Marcus and his attorney sat across the aisle. We hadn't spoken since our confrontation at the office, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Patricia Morrison was a 60-year-old woman with silver hair care and a reputation for fairness. She listened as both attorneys presented their arguments about the no contest clause. Jennifer argued that the clause shouldn't apply because I had probable cause to contest the will based on the deathbed letter and evidence of financial misconduct. Hoffman countered that the clause was clearly written and should be enforced regardless of my motivation. After an hour of legal arguments, Judge Morrison made her ruling. The no contest clause is valid, but the plaintiff has demonstrated sufficient probable cause to justify contesting the will. The case will proceed to trial. I felt a wave of relief. At least I'd have a chance to present my evidence in court, but the victory was short-lived. Over the next several weeks, Marcus's attorney began an aggressive discovery process, demanding access to my personal finances, my employment records, my therapy notes from work. They were trying to build a case that I was financially motivated and had influenced Dad to write the deathbed letter. Meanwhile, Jennifer was conducting her own investigation into Mitchell Construction's finances. What she found supported my claims about Marcus's unauthorized payments, but she also discovered that the business was in worse shape than anyone had realized. Your father was subsidizing the company's operations with personal funds for the last year of his life, Jennifer explained during one of our meetings. The business was generating revenue, but profit margins were declining, and your brother's spending was exceeding the company's actual earnings. So the $1.8 million valuation was wrong. It was based on projected earnings that assumed the business would continue operating at historical profit levels. But given the current financial trajectory, the company is worth significantly less than that. This revelation changed our strategy. Instead of just arguing about the inheritance split, we now had evidence that Marcus had been mismanaging the business and potentially defrauding its value. The trial was scheduled for September, 6 months after Dad's death. As the date approached, I realized that, regardless of the outcome, my relationship with Marcus was permanently damaged. We'd gone from distant siblings to bitter enemies, and there was no going back. Mom tried to mediate, suggesting that we settle out of court, but Marcus refused. He'd convinced himself that he was the victim in this situation, that I was trying to steal what he'd earned through years of hard work. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus accused me of being motivated by greed, while he was the one who'd been taking unauthorized payments from the business. He claimed I didn't understand the construction industry, while his mismanagement had nearly run the company into the ground. 2 weeks before the trial, Jennifer received an unexpected call from Robert Chen.
He wanted to testify as a witness. I've been thinking about my conversations with your father, Robert told us during a meeting at his office. There's something I didn't mention before, something that might be relevant to your case. He pulled out a file from his desk. Your father called me about 3 weeks before he died. He wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss revising his estate plan. Those were his exact words. I felt my heart racing. Did he say why? He said he'd been having second thoughts about the business succession, and he wanted to explore options for giving you a more significant role in the company. I scheduled the meeting for the following week, but then he had the heart attack. Jennifer leaned forward. Did he mention anything specific about changing the will? He didn't get into details, but he seemed concerned about Marcus's management style. He mentioned something about financial irregularities that he wanted to discuss with me. This was exactly the evidence we needed. Robert's testimony would establish that Dad had been planning to change his will and that he'd been aware of Marcus's unauthorized payments. But there was a problem. Robert's testimony would also reveal that he'd known about Dad's concerns and hadn't acted on them. It could expose him to malpractice liability. I understand the risk, said Robert, but I feel like I failed your father by not pushing harder for that meeting. If my testimony helps ensure his real wishes are honored, then it's worth it. The trial began on a Monday morning in September. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with just a few rows of seats for observers. Mom sat in the front row, looking tired and older than her 61 years. A few employees from Mitchell Construction were there, including Jerry Martinez, who'd come to support me. Judge Morrison called the court to order, and Jennifer began her opening statement. She laid out our case methodically. Dad's deathbed letter expressing his true wishes, evidence of Marcus's financial misconduct, and testimony that Dad had been planning to change his will before he died. The evidence will show that Robert Mitchell's final will does not reflect his actual intentions. It will show that he was pressured by his son Marcus, who was embezzling from the family business, and that he intended to leave his estate
equally to both of his children. Hoffman's opening statement was equally direct. He argued that Dad's will was clear and legally binding, that the deathbed letter was the confused ramblings of a dying man on medication, and that Marcus had been authorized to make all the financial decisions he had made. The plaintiff wants you to ignore a legally executed will based on a piece of paper written by a man who was dying and heavily medicated. She wants you to reward her for abandoning the family business while punishing her brother for dedicating his life to it. The first day of testimony focused on the circumstances surrounding Dad's death. Mom testified about Dad writing the letter in the hospital, confirming that he'd been lucid and coherent at the time. The attending physician testified about Dad's medication regimen, acknowledging that while he was on pain medication, he was mentally competent throughout his final days. Jennifer also called Jerry Martinez as a witness. He testified about Dad's management style, his concern for employees, and his disappointment with Marcus's approach to running the business. Mr. Mitchell was always talking about how the business was about more than just making money. He cared about the people who worked for him, but after he got sick and Marcus took over, things changed. It became all about the bottom line. The second day was more challenging. Hoffman put Marcus on the stand, and he came across as articulate and sympathetic. He talked about sacrificing his personal life for the business, about the stress of managing a company while his father was dying, about his love for both Dad and me. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Marcus said. "I was just trying to keep the business running and take care of my family. If I made mistakes with the financial records, it was because I was overwhelmed, not because I was trying to steal anything." Hoffman also presented evidence of my absence from the business over the years, painting me as someone who'd abandoned the family company and was now trying to claim it unfairly. Sarah Mitchell left home, moved to another state, and built a career that had nothing to do with construction, Hoffman argued. She showed no interest in the business until she learned how much it was worth. The third day was when Jennifer called Robert Chen to the stand. His testimony was devastating to Marcus's case. "Mr. Mitchell called me approximately 3 weeks before his death. He wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss revising his estate plan. He specifically mentioned concerns about the business succession and financial irregularities he discovered." Under cross-examination, Hoffman tried to discredit Robert's testimony, suggesting that Dad's phone call was vague and non-committal, but Robert held firm. Mr. Mitchell was very clear that he wanted to explore options for giving his daughter a more significant role in the company and the inheritance. He felt that his son was a capable manager, but lacked the interpersonal skills necessary to run a successful business long-term. Jennifer also called a forensic accountant who'd analyzed Mitchell Construction's financial records. His testimony confirmed that Marcus had taken approximately $200,000 in unauthorized payments over 2 years, and that the business was in declining financial health. The company's actual value is closer to $1.2 million than the $1.8 million stated in the will, the accountant testified. And given the current spending patterns, the business faces significant financial challenges going forward. The final day of testimony was emotional. Jennifer called me to the stand, and I told the jury about my conversations with Dad in the workshop, about his letter, about my discovery of the financial documents. My father spent 30 years building this business. He was proud of what he had accomplished, but he was also concerned about its future. He wanted to make sure it would continue to serve the community and take care of the people who worked there. Under cross-examination, Hoffman was aggressive, questioning my motives and my qualifications to run a construction company. "Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that you showed no interest in the family business until you learned how much it was worth?" "That's not true. I showed interest in the values that my father built the business on. I may not know about construction, but I know about people, and I know about building trust and relationships." "But you have no experience in construction, no business management background, no understanding of the industry." "No, I don't, but I have something my brother doesn't have. I understand what my father really wanted for this business." The closing arguments were scheduled for the following Monday. Over the weekend, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Dad, about his letter, about the possibility that I might lose everything. Jennifer's closing argument was passionate and persuasive. She walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece,
building a case that Dad's true intentions had been subverted by Marcus's pressure and manipulation. Robert Mitchell was a good man who built a successful business based on integrity and community service. His final will does not reflect his values or his true wishes.
It reflects the influence of a son who was embezzling from the business and pressuring his dying father to leave him everything. Hoffman's closing argument focused on the legal requirements for a valid will and the dangers of allowing deathbed letters to override official documents. If we allow dying declarations to supersede legally executed wills, we open the door to chaos. Hoffman argued, every disappointed heir will claim that their deceased relative had a change of heart at the last minute. The law requires more than that, and so should you. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, I could barely breathe. Judge Morrison asked the jury foreman to read the verdict. We find in favor of the plaintiff, he said. We find that the decedent's will does not reflect his true intentions, and we order that the estate be divided equally between the plaintiff and defendant. I felt a wave of relief and vindication, but also sadness. I'd won, but at the cost of my relationship with Marcus and months of family turmoil. But the victory was incomplete. Marcus's attorney immediately filed an appeal, and the legal battle was far from over. The appeals process dragged on for another 8 months. During that time, Mitchell Construction continued to operate under court supervision, with a neutral third party managing the business. The uncertainty was killing employee morale and affecting the company's ability to bid on new projects. I spent those months learning everything I could about the construction industry. I took night classes in business management, shadowed other construction company owners, and studied the files Dad had left behind. I was determined to prove that I could run the business if I got the chance. The appeal was based on technical legal arguments about the admissibility of Dad's deathbed letter and the standards for proving undue influence. Marcus's new attorney argued that the trial judge had made errors in allowing certain evidence and that the jury's verdict was not supported by the law. In March of the following year, the appeals court issued its decision. They upheld the trial court's ruling, but with modification. Instead of splitting the estate equally, they ordered that I receive 40% of the business and Marcus receive 60%, reflecting his greater experience and involvement in the company. It wasn't everything I had hoped for, but it was a significant victory. More importantly, the appeals court also ordered that Marcus pay back the $200,000 he'd taken in unauthorized payments, which would be deducted from his inheritance. After the appeals court decision, Marcus and I met for the first time in over a year. The meeting was tense and formal, held in a conference room at Jennifer's office. "I want to buy out your share," Marcus said without preamble. "I'll give you fair market value for your 40% and you can walk away clean." I'd been expecting this. Marcus had never wanted to work with me, and I understood why. It would be awkward and difficult to run a business with someone who just spent a year fighting you in court. "What's fair market value?" I asked. Jennifer had prepared for this question. Based on the forensic accountant's analysis, my 40% share was worth approximately $480,000. It was a substantial amount of money. Life-changing money, but it wasn't what Dad had wanted. "I need time to think about it," I said. Over the next few weeks, I visited the Mitchell Construction office several times, talking to employees, reviewing projects, trying to understand the business from the inside. What I found surprised me. The company was in better shape than I had expected. The court-appointed manager had tightened financial controls and improved efficiency. Several employees told me they'd been hoping I'd take an active role in the business. "Your dad always said you understood people. We could use someone like that around here."
But I also realized that Marcus was right about one thing. I had a lot to learn. The construction industry was complex, with regulations and relationships and technical requirements that I didn't fully understand. I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called Marcus and proposed a different arrangement. "I'll sell you my share," I said, "but I want to do it over time, and I want to stay involved in the business." "What do you mean?" "I'll sell you 20% of my share now, giving you 80% ownership and working control of the company. But I want to keep the other 20% and work as a partner. I'll handle human resources, employee relations, community outreach, the people side of the business. You handle operations, finances, and technical management." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Why would you want to do that?" "Because I think it's what Dad would have wanted. He didn't want us to destroy each other fighting over his legacy. He wanted us to work together to build something better. Sarah, after everything that's happened, I don't know if we can work together. Maybe we can't, but I think we owe it to Dad to try. And
I think we owe it to the people who work for this company. It took several more meetings and a lot of negotiation, but we eventually reached an agreement. Marcus would buy 20% of my shares for $240,000, giving him 80% ownership. I would keep 20% and work as a partner, focusing on human resources and business development. The arrangement wasn't perfect. Marcus and I had to learn to work together again, to rebuild trust that had been damaged by the legal battle. There were uncomfortable moments, disagreements about direction and priorities, times when I wondered if I'd made the right choice. But gradually, things improved. Marcus acknowledged that his financial management during Dad's illness had been problematic, and he implemented new controls to prevent similar issues. I brought a different perspective to the business, focusing on employee satisfaction and community relationships. The company's performance improved. Employee turnover decreased, customer satisfaction increased, and we started winning more competitive bids. Within 2 years, Mitchell Construction was more profitable than it had been during the last years of Dad's life. I never forgot about Dad's letter, about his wish that I inherit half of everything. But I realized that his real wish wasn't about money or ownership percentages. It was about ensuring that his life's work would continue to serve the community and take care of the people who depended on it. The legal battle had cost our family dearly. Mom never fully recovered from the stress of watching her children fight over their father's legacy. The relationship between Marcus and me was permanently changed. We were business partners now, not really siblings in the way we'd been before. But we'd also learned something important. Dad's true legacy wasn't the business itself. It was the values he'd instilled in us. The importance of integrity and community service and taking care of people. Those values had been tested during the inheritance dispute, but they'd ultimately prevailed. 3 years after Dad's death, I was sitting in the office late one evening reviewing employee feedback surveys when Marcus knocked on my door. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said. "I've been thinking about what happened, about the money I took from the business, about the way I handled everything after Dad got sick." He sat down across from my desk. I was wrong. I was scared about taking over the business, and I handled it badly. I should have talked to Dad about the financial stuff instead of just taking what I thought I deserved. "Marcus, no, let me finish. I also want you to know that having you as a partner has been good for the business. Dad was right about you understanding people. The employees respect the customers' trust, and the company is better because you're here." It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from my brother, and it meant more to me than any legal victory. "Dad would be proud of what we've built together," I said. "Yeah," Marcus replied. "I think he would." We sat there for a moment in comfortable silence, surrounded by the tools and plans and paperwork of the business Dad had spent his life building. Outside, the sun was setting over the town where Mitchell Construction had been installing foundations and building dreams for 30 years. Dad's deathbed letter had changed everything, not just the legal outcome, but the way Marcus and I understood our responsibilities to each other and to the business he'd left behind. It had taken a legal battle and years of difficult conversation, but we'd finally found a way to honor his true wish. Sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property. It's the values and relationships that survive long after the legal documents are filed away. That's what Dad really left us, and that's what we're still building on today. So that's my story. The letter my father wrote on his deathbed didn't just change my inheritance. It changed my entire life. It forced me to fight for what I believed was right, to learn about a business I'd never understood, and to rebuild a relationship with my brother that had been damaged by years of miscommunication and resentment. If you're dealing with family inheritance issues, or if you're worried about how your own estate planning might affect your children, I hope my story gives you some perspective. Money and property are important, but they're not the most important things you can leave behind. The most important inheritance is the example you set, the values you instill, and the relationships you build. Those are the things that really matter, and those are the things that last. I want to know what you think about this story. Have you dealt with similar family inheritance disputes? What would you have done in my situation? Leave a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this one resonate with you, real stories about family conflicts, legal battles, and the complicated relationships between money and love, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. I share new stories every week, and I promise they're always worth your time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.